The Royal Stockholm Concert Hall is quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet, the kind where 2,000 people are holding their breath. On stage sits a man the music world has listened to for decades, a man whose opinion can make careers or end them. And in the audience stands a musician no one here knows, no entourage, no reputation, no safety net. Just a few bronze gongs, some bamboo, and a sound the world once called primitive. What happens next will cost one man his certainty, give another his voice, and remind the internet of something it keeps forgetting. That true mastery does not always look modern, and innovation does not always come from the powerful. Sometimes it comes from those we were told not to listen to. Eric Lindstrom had earned the right to be confident. At 62, he was not just a musician. He was an institution, the kind of name spoken with certainty in conservatories and festival offices, the kind printed in bold on programs, not questioned, not debated. 3 Grammy Awards lined his shelves. Performances in over 50 countries filled his calendar. Collaborations with legends whose names were etched permanently into music history had shaped his sound and sharpened his authority. Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, artists who did not share stages lightly. For decades, Eric and his band, the Stockholm Collective, defined what Scandinavian jazz sounded like to the world. Not playful, not chaotic, but disciplined, complex, refined, intellectual. Music built on theory, precision, and restraint. Music that rewarded those who understood it. Critics trusted his ear because it had never failed them. When Eric praised a record, sales spiked. When he dismissed an approach, festivals quietly moved on. Young musicians studied his phrasing the way architecture students studied blueprints. They transcribed his solos, analyzed his harmonies, tried and usually failed to replicate his control. Festival directors built lineups around his presence. His name on a poster signaled seriousness, a promise that the music would not be shallow. Eric did not chase trends. He did not need to. Trends, more often than not, came to him seeking validation, and over time, something subtle happened. Authority became certainty. Certainty became expectation. Expectation hardened into belief. Eric believed he had seen it all, believed that innovation followed a recognizable path, that instruments evolved the way civilizations did, that sophistication was measurable, that progress was visible. So when the International Music Innovation Conference invited him to Stockholm in April 2018, it felt inevitable. Of course they invited Eric Lindstrom. Who better to speak about where music was going next? The topic was ambitious, the future of global music, a discussion about evolution, technology, and what sounds would define the next generation. And as Eric sat at the center of the panel, silver hair immaculate, tailored black suit, flawless, surveying the room with calm confidence, he looked exactly like someone who believed the future had already arrived, and that it was sitting right there with him. In the audience sat Carlos Santos, late 30s, unannounced, unintroduced. He did not arrive surrounded by attention, no assistants, no handlers, no one clearing a path for him through the crowd. If you were not looking for him, you would not notice him. He wore a simple barong Tagalog, light fabric, intricate embroidery, the kind worn for respect, not display. Beside his chair were his instruments, not polished by factories, not standardized, not mass-produced. A kulintang set of bronze gongs tuned by hand, bamboo percussion instruments shaped by patience, a kudyapi whose wood carried the marks of time. Each piece bore the quiet evidence of use. Carlos was not famous. He had never won an award that required a red carpet. His name was not printed in bold on programs, but he carried something Eric Lindstrom did not: continuity. Carlos came from Mindanao, from a lineage where music was not performed but inherited, where melodies were not written down but remembered, where rhythm was taught the way language is taught, by listening long before speaking. His grandmother had taught him to play before he could read. Her grandmother had taught her the same way. The music had survived colonization. It had survived erasure. It had survived being called noise. Carlos learned early what the world thought of his instruments, that they were simple, that they were backward, that they belonged in ceremonies, not concert halls. Teachers told him to learn piano if he wanted to be serious. Agents told him traditional music did not sell. Institutions told him there was no syllabus for what he knew, so he learned something else instead. Patience. He learned when to speak and when not to, when to demonstrate and when to endure. That was why he had not come to the conference to challenge anyone. He had not come to prove a point. He had been invited as a cultural showcase, a brief performance, a moment between discussions. Still, when the moderator opened the floor for questions, Carlos stood. Not because he believed he would change the room, but because his music had survived too much silence already. And for the first time that day, two worlds that had never truly listened to each other were about to collide. Carlos's voice did not shake. If anything, it carried the careful steadiness of someone who had asked this question many times before and already knew the risk of asking it again. He introduced himself simply. No resume, no credentials, just his name, and where he came from. Then he asked about incorporating indigenous instruments into modern jazz composition. He spoke of the kulintang, of bamboo percussion, of sounds that had existed for centuries. He did not demand validation. He asked for possibility. The room listened politely. Some nodded out of courtesy. Some waited for the answer they assumed was coming. Eric Lindstrom did not lean forward. He did not ask a follow-up question. He did not seek clarification. He leaned back, crossed one leg over the other, and smiled. Not a cruel smile, a confident one. The smile of someone who believes the matter is already settled. With all due respect, he began. The phrase landed like a warning. Filipino instruments are primitive. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Primitive, Eric continued, his voice calm, precise, almost instructional. He said they were fascinating from an anthropological perspective, useful for understanding pre-industrial cultures, valuable as historical artifacts, but not as serious instruments, not for professional composition, not for contemporary innovation. He spoke of tonal limitations, of lack of range, of imprecision. He said modern music demanded refinement, structure, evolution. What Carlos described, Eric explained, belonged in museums, not concert halls. A ripple moved through the audience. Some people shifted in their seats. Others stared straight ahead, unsure whether to react. Carlos remained standing. Eric was not finished. He spoke of his travels across Asia, of gamelan in Indonesia, of traditional Chinese orchestras, of Japanese instruments that had, in his words, evolved. Some cultures, he said, had refined their traditions to meet modern standards. Others had not. Philippine instruments, he concluded, were simple noisemakers. Banging gongs, hollow bamboo, charming in villages, inappropriate for innovation. A quiet gasp moved through the room. A few Filipino students lowered their eyes. Others clenched their fists. The moderator attempted to interject, but a German composer on the panel nodded. Eric has a point, he said. Not all cultural instruments translate to professional contexts. Some are better preserved as heritage, not adapted into spaces where they cannot compete. The word compete settled heavily. Carlos stood there, absorbing it all. No defense, no argument. He had heard these words before, from teachers who told him to choose a real instrument, from institutions that rejected his proposals, from people who had never once asked him to play. His grandmother's voice surfaced quietly in his mind. It lives because it carries our stories. Never let anyone tell you it is less. Carlos nodded, a small, respectful gesture. Then he sat down. The panel moved on. But something in the room had already broken, and everyone felt it. The conference did not end in chaos. There were no arguments shouted across the hall, no dramatic walkouts, no public confrontation. That made it worse. The panel continued as if nothing unusual had happened. The moderator redirected the discussion. The audience listened, but no one was fully present anymore. Something had shifted. People glanced at Carlos, then at Eric, then back to the stage. The words, "primitive" and "museum" still echoed in the air, refusing to settle. Carlos did not leave early. He stayed until the final session ended. He listened. He took notes. He applauded when appropriate. If anyone expected anger, they did not get it. He gathered his instruments carefully, packed them the way you pack something fragile, even when it has survived centuries, and he walked out of the Royal Stockholm Concert Hall unnoticed, but the room did not forget him. Within hours, clips from the panel began circulating online. Not the full discussion. Just the moment. Just the smile. Just the word. Primitive. Filipino musicians reacted first. Some were furious, some were exhausted. Most were not surprised. They had heard the same dismissal in different languages their entire lives. Cultural scholars weighed in, musicians debated. Forums filled with arguments about tradition versus progress. Eric Lindstrom's defenders spoke calmly. He was being honest, they said. He was talking about technical limitations. Not culture. His critics used a different word. Arrogance. By morning, the hashtags had names. Respect Filipino music. Listen before you judge. Carlos watched none of it. He did not issue a statement. He did not post a response. He did not explain himself to the internet. Instead, he returned home. Back to Mindanao. Back to the place where the music had never needed permission. His grandmother's house still smelled of wood and old books. Her instruments still rested in the same corner. Carlos sat on the floor and played. Not to prove a point. Not for an audience. But to remember why he started. He thought about every time he had been told his music was less. Every door that had closed politely. Every opportunity that required him to change first. He understood something clearly now. Arguing would change nothing. But excellence might. And so, quietly, without announcing anything to the world, Carlos began preparing. For a while, the internet argued. Then it moved on. Outrage has a short attention span. New controversies arrived. New villains replaced old ones. Eric Lindstrom returned to touring. Interviews continued. Festivals still sold out. To the world, the moment had passed. To Carlos Santos, it had not. He did not wake up thinking about Eric Lindstrom. He woke up thinking about sound, about what his instruments could do that no one had bothered to ask. Every morning, before the heat settled in, Carlos played. Not full pieces, fragments, short phrases, intervals, rhythmic cells. He listened carefully to how the kulintang responded, how pitch shifted with touch, how resonance changed with spacing. He documented everything, what the gongs could sustain, where the bamboo spoke best, how silence functioned between notes. Then he did something unexpected. He began studying jazz the way an engineer studies blueprints. Chord theory, modal interchange, voice leading, not to abandon tradition, but to meet criticism on its own terms. If the accusation was lack of sophistication, then sophistication would be undeniable. Carlos spent nights transcribing Eric Lindstrom's solos, not out of admiration, out of curiosity. He traced the logic behind the phrases, the restraint, the discipline. He learned what Eric valued. Then he asked a dangerous question. What would happen if ancient instruments spoke that language fluently? He reached out to a Filipino composer in Manila. Together, they built structures that respected both worlds. No shortcuts, no gimmicks. They tested tunings, adjusted spacing, extended ranges. Carlos worked with instrument makers who had never been asked to modernize tradition without erasing it. Bamboo was selected, rejected, replaced. Gongs were retuned by hand. Months passed. The music grew denser, more layered, more confident. Carlos built pieces that could not be dismissed as folk demonstrations. They were compositions. He practiced transitions between instruments until movement itself became rhythm. Every decision served one goal: to let the instruments speak fully. By the time autumn approached, Carlos had not written a response. He had built one, and the world had no idea it was coming. The email arrived without ceremony. No dramatic subject line, no apology, no explanation, just an invitation. The Stockholm Jazz Festival. October. Main program. Carlos read it twice, then a third time. This was not a cultural showcase, not a side stage, not a daytime demonstration tucked between panels. This was the night program, the kind that critics attended, the kind that careers were built on. The festival director, Ingrid Halverson, had seen the video from April. She had also listened to Carlos's recordings. Not once, repeatedly. She heard something others had not bothered to hear. Not potential, not novelty, authority. She placed Carlos's name on the bill deliberately, and she placed it carefully, right before Eric Lindstrom. When Eric's management received the program, the response was immediate. Confusion first, then resistance. Eric was displeased. "This is a jazz festival," he said, "not a world music curiosity show." He argued that the programming diluted the event's credibility, that it confused the audience, that it distracted from the art form. Ingrid did not argue back. She stated facts. "Carlos Santos is a serious musician. Your comments in April were inappropriate. This is an opportunity to listen." Eric considered withdrawing. His reputation could withstand controversy, but silence on a headline stage carried consequences. Management advised him to stay. Leaving would look like avoidance. Staying would look like confidence. So Eric agreed, not with enthusiasm, with certainty. Back in the Philippines, Carlos prepared quietly. No announcement, no press release. He informed his wife, his family, a few mentors. That was all. He packed his instruments with care, each one chosen, for a reason, each one capable of speaking when asked. As the plane lifted from Manila, Carlos closed his eyes. He was not thinking about redemption. He was not thinking about revenge. He was thinking about timing. Because sometimes history does not change through argument. It changes when the right sound meets the right room. The lights dimmed. Carlos began alone. A melody older than the hall itself. The Kudyapi sang. The Kulintang answered. Rhythms layered, voices intertwined. Then something shifted. Jazz harmony emerged. Swing appeared. Improvisation breathed. Autumn leaves, reimagined, recognizable, transformed. This was not novelty. This was mastery. People leaned forward, pens scribbled, phones lifted. Backstage, Eric stopped speaking. For the first time in decades, he listened. Silence. 3 seconds. Then eruption. 2,000 people standing, clapping, shouting. 5 minutes. History. Carlos bowed, hands shaking, heart full. Eric approached him backstage. No cameras requested. No performance. Just a hand extended. I was wrong. 40 years of certainty shattered by listening too late. Carlos accepted the apology with grace. They spoke not of victory, but of bridges. The handshake video went viral. Millions shared it. Not because someone lost, but because someone learned. 3 months later, the album Bridges was released. A Grammy followed. Then invitations. Filipino instruments entered jazz programs worldwide, not as curiosities, as equals. True innovation does not erase the past, it listens to it. The most dangerous phrase in any creative field is not, "I disagree," it is, "I already know." Because the moment we stop listening, we stop growing. If this story moved you, share it. If you believe excellence speaks louder than prejudice, subscribe, because there are countless voices the world has not listened to yet, and their moment is coming.